So we are ready to start our next panel, indeed our first panel today, about the success story of Wi-Fi 6E and the path to Wi-Fi 7. We're going to hear some updates and ongoing activities. And I would like to encourage all the participants to ask questions to our experts. Here we have delegates from different companies that have been leading all the activities related to Wi-Fi 6E and Wi-Fi 7. So this is the opportunity to make sure you ask all your questions and make sure you get the last updates in terms of the technology. And I'm also very glad to invite our moderator, so Philippe Defraigne. He's a founding director of Cullen International, a company monitoring regulatory developments in telecommunications. I'm sure many of you have heard or read the reports from Cullen. They also work on digital economy, media, postal, competition law, and sustainability. Philippe is an economist by training and has spent the last 30 years analyzing telecommunications regulation and market development. He has been frequently speaking at different events, and I'm also very excited because it's the first time that Philippe is attending our DSA Global Summit. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation, Philippe.
Thank you for the invitation, Martin. I was joking with Mario this morning that for people like myself who normally spend all these days learning about regulation, studying regulation, going to a Wi-Fi event or a DSA event is a bit crossing the river, you know, going to the other side. And just like Mario, I'm very excited to discover your community and learn about your activities. Certainly what I heard this morning is very, very impressive. And this session is very much about building upon what we learned this morning and yesterday, and going a bit deeper into practical application that we can already see today of rollout of Wi-Fi 6E and the upcoming Wi-Fi 7. And to help us with that, we have a very distinguished panel. We've got Scott Blue from Cisco, David Wright from HPE. You already know Chris, and Guillaume Lebrun, who many of you know, from Meta. We could perhaps start with you, Guillaume. I think that you've got an interesting testimony of how modern Wi-Fi technology could be used in the educational sphere and how Wi-Fi could help modernize, change our schools.
Yes, and I've got the technical content, so this guy's going to have the fun content later, so it's probably good to start with the hard stuff. Yeah, we're pretty much a user of Wi-Fi. For us, it's not Wi-Fi which is important, it's a service which is running on top of it. And as part of that, one question is what happens to AR, VR application, or what happens to the metaverse if you're in a dense environment? So the example here is a school, and I'll get back to that, but you could think also of, let's say, Boeing or Airbus if they're designing an airplane. Most of them are going to go to this kind of VR or AR augmented design, and you're talking 100 engineers in an open space trying to do this kind of activity. So it's really looking at what happens to the quality of the experience of the user when you're in such a dense environment. And so what we did, and it was working with a regulator in Asia that was interested in what happens to their school and what is possible in their school. So it's a practical interest from a government about understanding if kids could actually have some of the learning assisted by VR, extended by VR, and so looking at what would be possible within a classroom. And then we were trying to understand what is the relationship between spectrum availability and the quality of experience in the classroom. So the setup of the simulation was quite simple. We're looking at one classroom and we're looking at kids having a VR headset on their heads. And we're trying to understand how many kids can actually do that without having a degradation of the performance of what they feel. And so looking at that, we basically compare what happens when we have 3 channels of 160 megahertz. Like we started with 160, thinking that's a future standard for a good functioning Wi-Fi network. And looking at what's the difference between having 7 channels and 3 channels. And you will see that it comes pretty quickly. And typically in a school, you can have these 2 rows of classrooms, and we decided that we would have 1 access point per classroom to make sure that everything is functioning well. And you could replicate that in 3 dimensions. And one of the output of the study is that when we look at a concrete reinforced floor, there's actually no correlation between the basement, the ground floor, and the first floor. So actually each floor is separate, and that allows to really deploy with a high density. Think about a high scraper. You could have a different network on each floor, and they would not interfere too much with each other. So that's the first good news. However, these classrooms, they do interfere with each other because you don't have a reinforced concrete wall between them. What's the application that we're running? Well, actually, if you're thinking about this kind of VR, it may not be that high throughput. And so here we're looking at 50 megabits per second. Of course, if you're doing gaming, it's going to go much higher because instead of having a pretty static picture, people are going to start doing things very fast. But you don't want kids to be playing games. You want kids to be learning, and that's typically something more static of environment. But what you do need is latency. And that is not for speed. That is just because if the latency becomes too high between the movement of your head and what you see on the screen, that's when you get motion sickness, VR sickness, however you call it. And typically what we estimate is that it's good to stay between 20 milliseconds with a pretty good probability. So we're looking at 90% probabilities that the latency is below 20 milliseconds. So it's not super high requirements. If you're looking at more advanced robotics kind of things, Intel had a white paper where they were looking at much higher data rate, like around 100 and 150, and they were looking at 1 millisecond latency. In that context, in the educational context with more relaxed environment, you will still see that the spectrum availability makes a difference. And that's an example. So if you look at the row of classrooms that you see at the bottom left of your screen.
Sorry, Guillaume, what was the latency requirement, would you say, ideally for this sort of application?
20 milliseconds.
20 milliseconds. Okay.
Stay below 20 milliseconds. So if you look at the 2 rows of classroom, depending on whether you have a 3-channel use case or a 7-channel use case, you see that the green dot, which is a class trying to receive the signal, is interfered by classes which are either just there, next door, or much further away. And that is reflected into the latency chart that you see on the right side of your screen. And so the blue line is where there's no interference, and you can see that the system breaks down around 10 or 12. It starts to diverge when you have only 3 channels because of the interference. And when you have 7, you go up to 22. And the other interesting part is that when you're trying to increase the number of classrooms, and within one classroom try to increase the number of users, what you find is that it's not the throughput which is breaking down first. So most users get the throughput, not a problem, and one of the demo which is outside is showing exactly that you can share the throughput fairly well, but the latency gets impacted, and so the experience for the user gets impacted. And so it's always a latency which breaks down first, not the throughput, which is sometimes why it makes it difficult for people to say, hey, why do you need all this bandwidth? Well, you need to keep the latency low, and you also need it to keep the battery life longer. You want this device which are on your head, which can get really hot. You want them to switch on, send maximum data, switch off. So for 3 channels, what you see is that as soon as you have 4 or 6 classrooms, the number of kids per classroom drops down to like 4 or 6 kids that can do VR at the same time. This is no longer a functional school. Or you really have to limit the experience for the kids. They can't do VR at the same time. If you move to 7, then what you see is when you increase the number of classrooms from 1 to 14, you may not get exactly the same number that you had with one isolated classroom, because of course there is some interference, but basically we move from 25 users to 23 users. And then it plateaus, and you could increase your school, because then the classroom becomes very separated physically, and you can keep your number of users. So what you see is that 7-channel, you were referring to that this morning, a great number to have to do a dense deployment where the access point will not interfere with each other, which means the capacity of each access point is maintained when you scale your system up. So that's kind of the summary. We see a very big difference when we have this kind of channel diversity, where the performance of the system are not dropping, or when you don't have channel diversity, pretty quickly your capacity is plummeting, and it's not so much a capacity in terms of throughput, is the user experience, the connectivity experience due to the latency. One of the big questions that we received based on this study, I mean, it was one regulator asking us to do that. They were directly interested and they had some insight in the future. Some of them were like, well, is it really realistic that people are going to do this kind of high connectivity in a learning environment? And that's exactly the example of the University of Michigan, where you will see that what the people that are forward looking at doing in terms of connectivity in a learning environment is mind-blowing. And I'm just going to finish with an anecdote. Alan and I, our boss, has got a daughter which is in a nursing school, and he was pretty excited to learn about all these learning application for nurses. And so he goes to her and goes, hey, you know that perhaps sometime in the future you're going to do some learning on VR. And her reply was, Dad, I was doing that 3 years ago. The university has always had that. And so that's where we see that these things are taking up much quicker than we see. And the younger generation, they're going to be used to this VR, AR, and they will want to be able to use it, not just isolated, but at scale in this kind of environment.
Well, just a quick comment on the substance, VR and education. I strongly believe that it is shocking that with the advancement of IT in general, we are still, most of the time, whether it's in primary school or at university, teaching classes as if everybody in the room had the same knowledge, which is exactly what we're doing today, which is the wrong thing to do, actually. But what you want to do, of course, is to understand what each student, kids or adults like you today, know before they walk into the room, and then have a tailor-made program, which is perhaps a bit difficult for cutting-edge subjects today, but certainly is easy for standards math or French, for example. Impossible to learn French, you know. That's you want a tailor-made. So yes, Guillaume, I'm sold on that. And if VR can help, so much better.
But that's a good example. Think about how you learn foreign languages at school today. You got one teacher trying to tell you some grammatic rules. With VR, you could have a virtual friend which is just having a conversation with you. And think about the impact how it would change the learning of a foreign language. It's just massive.
Thank you, Guillaume. So now we go to you, Dave, still on about how Wi-Fi 6E, Wi-Fi 7 can help in the education environment, but going back to University of Michigan that Chris alluded to this morning.
Yes. Hello. I think I'm on. Great. So I am Dave Wright with Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, but for the next hopefully about 10 minutes, if not sooner, I'm actually going to be channeling Dr. Ravi Penze, who is the CIO at the University of Michigan. And we'd hoped that Dr. Penze might be able to join us. Unfortunately, he couldn't travel, but he was kind enough to give me permission to make this presentation on behalf of the university. I was present when they presented this about a month ago to a different audience, and again, they were kind enough to let me do this. So yeah, I was actually a Russian major in college, so I would love to have had a VR experience to go get situational awareness and have to challenge myself that way. It would have been a lot better way to learn it than from a book. But anyhow, University of Michigan. Chris mentioned a little bit about the deployment in his presentation. Key data point there was that there are over 16,000 Wi-Fi 6E access points deployed now at the University of Michigan. It's a university, it's one of the largest universities in the US. I think it's one of the largest universities in the world. So they've got 3 campuses, they've got 64,000 students at the university. Their budget's about $12 billion, more top 10 programs than any other institution in the world. And Chris mentioned the research aspect, or the sort of research angle of the University of Michigan. So they have a $1.6 billion research budget alone, which supports all of the different research programs that they partner with industry or that they do themselves. So research is hugely important to the University of Michigan. So some of the things that really drove them towards having a cutting-edge, next-generation Wi-Fi 6E deployment. These are just a few examples of some of the use cases, that again, they were really trying to support with Wi-Fi 6E. One of them being robotics. They've got a lot going on with industry partners being in Michigan. That's the heart of the U.S. automotive industry, so you can imagine they have partnerships with a number of the U.S. automakers, as well as other robotics manufacturers. And these robots need, good connectivity. They need it outdoors, they need it indoors. So they're looking for both cellular and Wi-Fi connectivity. They need it to be reliable. They need it to have low latency characteristics, like Guillaume was just talking about. So Wi-Fi 6E was something that was very attractive to them from that perspective. Location is also a very important attribute for these robots. They want them to be able to navigate onto an elevator, go up a few floors, then navigate somewhere, within a building. So indoor location is extremely important as well. So I just thought I would mention that. Student dorms. So they've got they have a 400 gigabit per second connection to the internet through the, what is it, Hyperland 2 or whatever it's called. There's a backbone in the US which connects most of the higher ed institutions. So they have a 400 gigabit connection to the internet. And so Dr. Penze's mission statement is we will not let the Wi-Fi be a bottleneck to access. And I think Chris talked about we don't want Wi-Fi to be the bottleneck to the broadband access. So that's certainly something that Dr. Penze embraces. And so you've got, again, 64,000 students, or the vast majority of them living on campus in dormitories. Most of them now have 5, 6, 7, 8 different devices that they're connecting. So, providing, gigabit type connectivity in the dorm rooms, and then taking that into the classroom. So I'll just quickly mention that, for the university, one of their objectives was in the large lecture halls, which they have, where they could have 200 or 300 students in a single lecture room. They want to be able to deliver a 4K or 8K video stream to each student, and do that reliably without any latency. So again, these are the kinds of things that we're seeing 6 gigahertz enabling with Wi-Fi 6E. Football stadium, college football.
Dave, I'm sorry to interrupt, just to get a bit of interactivity, and perhaps I'm playing the devil's advocate, just for you to be able to, perhaps some old-fashioned people in the room had that crazy idea crossing their mind. Why do you want to put 300 people in a room and have video fed to each of them? Why would you want that?
Yeah,
sorry to put you on the spot. Maybe
that's a great question, and that's actually
Guillaume is also right to help.
Okay, I was just going to say one of the nice things about me being in this position is I can't necessarily give you all the background, on the university's thinking.
No, it's unfair, completely unfair on my part, because Dave is kindly helping out for.
Yeah. I don't know, Guillaume. Do you want to feel that? I mean, I have some theories, but I don't know if you have any thoughts. I mean, my first thought would just be that, even if you've got 300 students in the room, just to illustrate a point to them, you might want to bring up a video, and, the guy at the back doesn't have to strain to see the screen in the front and things like this. But
well, for us, more fundamentally, if you do VR, your video is not the same as someone else. So the compute is probably somewhere just after that Wi-Fi link. But the video that is sending to you is different than the video is sending to me, just because you're looking in that direction, I'm looking in that direction. So what the picture you see is not the one that I see. Yeah. And when I turn my head, if my head turning changes your picture, it's a problem. Right, so basically with VR, everybody gets their own video because that's the way we do in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah, I think virtual class trip, right? If we have 300 people with VR headsets and we go to Egypt to see the Sphinx, right? And we're all walking around, we have different vantage points, et cetera.
Yeah. So, thank you both. Thank you both.
I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit here, but football stadium, college football is huge in the U.S. The stadium here where the University of Michigan football team plays is called, well, it's nicknamed the Big House. and it seats 114,000 fans. And they have very high expectations about their connectivity. They pay a lot of money to go to these games. And one of the points that Ravi would make is that it's not just about receiving content now, so it's not just about downstream. Most of them now are uploading content during the game, so they're seeing a good amount of upstream traffic as well. And I just wanted to, this is me jumping in to make a point. Guillaume rightly pointed out that in a school and most corporate environments, a 7-channel plan works really quite well in terms of spacing the access points so you don't have co-channel interference. It's a huge issue in a stadium, right? When you're trying to cover one of these bowls, Cisco, my company, we have teams that just specialize on these types of deployments because they're so complex. And in a stadium like this, you would need probably 15 to 20 channels. So a 7-channel plan actually isn't even adequate. So just a little side note. Digital Education Studio kind of in the upper left, this is what they use to train the MBAs. It's, or they have an online business program, I should say. So there's screens on the floor, screens on the wall, and it's basically an immersive MBA program, okay? So I'm not going to spend much time here. I'll just say that the University of Michigan is a very big advocate of open standards technologies, and they listed a number of things that sort of have, their origins as open standards. They talk about sort of these things not necessarily being taken seriously early, in their life cycles, and now they're, kind of the dominant way we connect, on a daily basis. So they would add Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi 6E to that. Low regulatory overhead, constantly evolving standards that institutions like the University of Michigan can participate in, and that they have some control over this. And the bottom line is it creates that innovation sort of sandbox that we've been talking about quite a bit the last couple of days. Okay. So again, what does Wi-Fi 6E bring to the University of Michigan? We talked about the importance of the robotics research and partnerships. And in looking at how Wi-Fi 6E can meet a lot of the requirements, particularly in building, while they still use the cellular technologies, particularly for outdoor and mobile coverage. They're extremely interested in the wider channel bandwidths. So when you need 7 channels in a school, or you need 15 channels or 20 channels in a stadium, that's great. But if I can only do that with 20 megahertz channels and 5 gigahertz, but I can take that to 80 megahertz wide channels in 6 gigahertz. That's a huge improvement. So that's one of the things that my company is extremely interested in, and the improvement in latency, as Guillaume talked about. Location information, we mentioned the robots' need for that. So one of the things that I really appreciated, and this is their presentation. I didn't ask them to include this, but they're really looking for worldwide harmonization around the full 1200 megahertz in 6 gigahertz. It sets us up very nicely for Wi-Fi 7 and the potential for 320 megahertz channels, as Chris mentioned. And then it's really about the ecosystem, right? So we need a global ecosystem. We've already got the US, Canada, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Dominican Republic. Now with the full 1200 megahertz allocation, so the more people we can get signing onto that, the quicker the ecosystem will form. Mentioned the stadium. Obviously, it's an outdoor stadium, so to cover the bowl, we cannot do that today with 6 gigahertz in the U.S. We have the low power indoor mode is what's currently approved. So they're very excited about the opportunity to do standard power, so that we can do outdoor deployments. And I've actually done some testing of what kind of standard power channel availability looks like in the stadium. So we can talk about that later when Detlef does a demonstration. Okay, so
sorry, Dave, on the previous slide.
Oh, yes.
So this is a slide, you just presenting the slides of University of Michigan, and just to remind the audience, Dave is working for HP, yeah, but why would the University of Michigan be interested in seeking worldwide support for the 1200? What's in it for them? I mean, they are a US university. In the US, it's 1200. The US were the pioneers. So what's in it for them?
I think it links again to even this slide where they talked about sort of the strong history of open standards and how, as these technologies have evolved and embraced at a global level, it created this mass market ecosystem which was somewhat unstoppable, and it lowered the price points for everybody who participates, right? So I think one of the aspects of why they would like to see 1200 megahertz harmonized is, again, the ecosystem formation that will occur, and therefore, you know, prevalence of devices and lower cost
Economies of
devices.
scale, prices go down. And
Yep.
okay. Thank you, Dave.
Sure.
And sorry again to put you on spot
No,
on
and
slides
I'm
which you didn't write. So.
I'm going to try to wrap up because I'm probably taking more time than I meant to, but
it's fine.
you know, bottom line, the University of Michigan sees significant value from both cellular and Wi-Fi technologies. So I want to make sure that's a clear message being delivered here, particularly, you know, with Wi-Fi being the primary indoor coverage technology. You know, low incremental cost, the ability to actually capture a lot of what otherwise might have gone over the cellular network via quote-unquote offload. I'm not a big fan of that term. So, you know, certainly they expect both technology families to continue to evolve and to grow. And in order for Wi-Fi to have that, you know, growth path and ability to innovate, you know, they believe that 1200 megahertz is, you know, is critical, both for Wi-Fi 7, 320 megahertz channels, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and one of the other points that they made here was that, you know, Wi-Fi has been waiting a very long time for additional mid-band spectrum. So, you know, it's been upwards of 20 years now. It's kind of amazing that we've been able to do what we have as an industry for 20 years with no additional mid-band allocations. So, you know, here we go. I'll also mention that one of the other drivers for all of this is they're trying to reduce the number of switch ports that they have on the campus. So even desktops that they'll be ordering going forward, they'll be looking to equip those with Wi-Fi 6E capability versus putting a gigabit Ethernet or 2.5 gig, gig Ethernet port into those. And that will reduce the number of switches they need and also help reduce their energy requirements. So there's some environmental and green aspects to it. So I think I'll wrap there. Again, bottom line, they're looking for constant evolutions and upgrades of both Wi-Fi and cellular technology families, and they did want to provide their contact information. So Dr. Penze and his associate Andy, who's the executive director of infrastructure, these are their emails. And if you do have any questions, I mean, feel free to ask me and I'll answer them if I can, but they would be more than happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dave, for having taken the responsibility of presenting those slides. You know, it's always difficult to speak on other people's slides. We'll come back later, Dave, on you know, with the help of others panelists, on one of the last issues you mentioned, which is, but we'll come back to that later, but the replacement of wires for LAN by Wi-Fi 6E, which, and this being greener, you know, that I'd like to explore. Scott, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm Scott Blue from Cisco, not from Microsoft anymore, so it's odd being in this building. There you go. So I kind of changed up my slides at the last minute. After Huawei decided to take a run at Saul in a post that he made to LinkedIn, kind of suggesting that that there needed to be equal attention paid to having cellular in the upper 6 versus Wi-Fi. And I have some from data from governments, customers, and from the Fortune 500 companies that Cisco services. We have 50% globally of the enterprise Wi-Fi market, and at the same time, we manage more than 1.5 billion endpoints in 5G networks through our core system. So we don't necessarily have skin in one side or the other. What we do for our customers is we find what the next technology is going to be, and we scale it, and we deliver globally. So I started with this slide from the GSMA's Internet Value Chain, a report that they put out earlier this year. And part of the justification for this is people in Europe will know we have the operators here thinking that the over-the-top providers should be funding the network build-outs
Pay des faire cher, you know. Taxing.
Well,
It's funny because I live in Brussels, and you have the same conversation, and the telco say fair share, and then the OTC are saying taxation of internet.
well, I think what will happen in reality, just to derail this a little bit, is that given that 80% of the internet traffic over the cellular networks is free video, we'll just see a massive drop in the quality of the video. And then there will be less video and even less need for spectrum for them. But anyways, I think that was the basis of this report. So anyways, so the GSMA likes to say, well, the Wi-Fi industry this and the Wi-Fi industry that. And really the people that are supporting Wi-Fi in the upper six are everybody other than the mobile access piece of this, from the people that build the content, to the people that build the hardware devices, to the fixed infrastructure, and everything in between. So, really it's this 9% of the industry, or I think they say 15% here, versus the rest of the industry, and there's a couple of reasons why for that. But just another interesting fact that you can take away from this graph is that they're saying that that mobile access connectivity generates over $600 billion globally, and they're currently delivering 6% of internet traffic. Whereas the fixed community is taking in $335 billion globally and delivering 94% of internet traffic. So, why is the greater content infrastructure industry interested in Wi-Fi over mobile networks? Well, it's because it's 28 times more expensive to deliver your content over to deliver your content over the mobile networks, which, we should be concerned about when we're talking about, well, the 5 and 6G is going to save us in developing countries, and somehow that wireless is more efficient when, we have this, just the bare numbers of, and these are the GSMA's numbers about how things roll out between the two.
I'm not GSMA, okay? If I was GSMA, I'd probably say there are probably wide variation. If you take rich countries, there was probably more of a balance, and perhaps in less developed countries, it's mobile, and fixed is pretty small, no? So this is a huge averaging there, worldwide averaging, which probably hides big differences between these two worlds. I mean, I don't know. I'll stop there because I'm beyond my job of being the moderator.
And my clapback for that is always in countries that don't have a lot of connectivity. They certainly don't need more spectrum.
I'm enjoying the way you use the GSMA report and re-engineering. It's a lot of fun. Is it recorded, this thing? Or I hope not.
Well, we won't share these slides outside of here. So once again, I'm defending Saul. I thought that he was unfairly had a run taken at him, and so I wanted to defend it. And then once again, just another slide from another presentation on the socio-economic benefits for mid-band spectrum for 5G, which is where they're going after the upper six. And they talk about if they don't have sufficient spectrum, how it's going to impact global GDP. And they come up with this list that comes up with a value that is just about the same value as today's global cellular industry in what they're going to be doing by 2030 in all of these different verticals. What this appears to be, to me, is the value of wireless connectivity for Industry 4.0, assuming that the GSMA and their customers take 100% of that pie. And currently they're at something less than 5%. So this would be Wi-Fi goes away, and they have a monopoly on the market, which of course if they're able to license the spectrum and we can't get the determinism that Guillaume is talking about, they might have a run at that. But what my customers have said is that they'd like something different. So as I mentioned, we had this conference called Cisco Live for the first time. It was live in 3 years in June. And it was bringing together the executives from our customers who are in the Fortune 500 and large government customers globally. And we have this thing called the Whisper Suite, where people come in and they get to see our next generation products. And you get to see things like our next rev of our Wi-Fi software with 80% load in an enterprise has 90% of stations getting sub 1 millisecond latency. It's all things, we were talking about lots of things that are around the corner. Well, there's something that will be out before Wi-Fi 7. Anyways, it's kind of boring to have slides about that. So focused on some of the outputs, because one of the things to get into the Whisper Suite is on the way out, you have to fill in a form. And this is the information that we track from that. So here is the big thing. In those applications that the GSMA was talking about in the previous slide, here's where the growth is coming from. And from IoT devices, we're talking of everything from temperature monitors to robots. We now have one customer, somebody from the companies in the room, that has 800,000 robots globally, and virtually all of them are running on Wi-Fi. I think there's about 80,000 3GPP-based robots globally. So we have one customer with 10 times more. And this is the kind of growth that the people in the decision-making power in the big companies see in IoT just in the next 3 years. Next 3 years? Between 22 and 25.
Okay, so can I ask a question quickly? Sorry. I just want to make sure I understood the slide. So the expectation in 22 was that they would deploy this many IoT devices in the next year?
Right, of the companies that were surveyed.
Understood.
Right.
Okay, so their expectations has gone from predominantly 1,000 to 10,000 to now 10,000 to 100,000 plus.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you.
And this is a terrible slide, and I was only able to get the picture of it, and I only delivered this deck early this morning because I was really hoping to rebuild it, but let me do my best to explain it. The people leaving the Whisper Suites were asked to rank of all the technology demonstrations that they'd seen, and they saw technology demonstrations on all of these products, including we dropped millions and millions of dollars on a private 5G solution, where they thought the different technologies that are out there ranked in those hundreds of thousands of devices that they wanted to deploy in IoT by 2025. And so the dominant colors are the thing to look at, because that is where most people voted where they saw these particular technologies in importance in the stack ranking. And then the second color here is the second most and third most, and how that translates across the board, I'm not 100% sure. But what is pretty clear here is that about 75% of people said that they expected all IoT devices, or the important IoT devices, to be on Wi-Fi. And then Bluetooth was second, Zigbee was third. Thread and Matter, things that most people don't even know about, but that are taking on steam both in the consumer and the enterprise, that are both 802.15-based technologies. And then private 5G, which was kind of disappointing to us because we kind of did think it was going to be the next big thing.
I've never heard of Zigbee, Thread and Matter. I'm sure people in the room are more knowledgeable than me, but so if 5G is after that, that's after three things I've never heard about, this is worrying.
And then at the very end of it all.
So I see people nodding. You've not heard of this either? or
At the very end of it all was tying your IoT devices to public networks.
This is very worrying, Scott. Very worrying.
So this is where we sit today when we have the Huawei's and the Ericssons of the world saying, well, but something different is going to happen. These are the people that spend half the IT budget in the world, and this is what they think is going to happen. It's not my company pushing something. It's not some organization putting something. This is what the folks that write the checks to buy the equipment.
Scott, on this one?
Sure.
I just want to your point about Huawei and Ericsson. Ericsson in their mobility report used to have a forecast for IoT connected devices that I loved, because they broke it out essentially into long range and short range, licensed and unlicensed. They stopped reporting it because me and others were making so much, drawing so much attention to it. But I think the last report I saw was maybe 2018. So admittedly, this is dated. But back then, they were forecasting for the next 5 years that, fully it was 88% of the IoT connected devices were going to be connected with unlicensed technologies, and that was Ericsson. So, to your point.
Well, and Cisco in our VNI that has been spot on for so many things for so many years, projected by now that 35% of devices should be connected to cellular networks. And that just fundamentally changed over the pandemic because fiber started to roll out more. And now it really is 4 or 5%. And that's just what happened to the market because the fiber's there now. And then the other thing, of course, is that the fiber being rolled out supports 10 gig a second. And in Switzerland, we have 4 of the operators rolling out fiber doing 10 gig fiber with 2 gig Wi-Fi on the end of it. So it's very difficult. They're going to have problems. People are going to do the speed test, and they're not able to provide the Wi-Fi that supports the connectivity that they're provisioning. And they certainly aren't going to be able to once you have that in apartments and your neighbors are using the only 320 available channel. So the conclusion is, Cisco's position is given that more than 90% of wireless internet capacity is delivered by Wi-Fi and unlicensed technologies, it's fair and reasonable that 60% of mid-band spectrum is given to technologies that let enterprises and consumers to deploy their own networks, right? We're not asking for 95% of the spectrum because 95% is delivered by unlicensed. But 40% seems pretty reasonable for them to deliver their 5%. And the GSMA's position that they continue to push at WRC and other places is despite that less than 8% of wireless internet capacity is delivered by their networks, it's fair and reasonable to allocate the upper 6, which would give them 75% of mid-band capacity for macrocellular deployments for the future expansion of 5G. Doesn't make any sense. Thank you.
We'll go back to that. We'll go back. Not so fast. Not so fast. Thank you, Scott. Chris, you want to say something before we start?
I'm enjoying what you're saying. Actually, I've had a grin.
That's
on
why I
my
was
face this whole
invited,
time,
to stir up a bit. Otherwise, you all agree. So what do we discuss?
So in actuality, Broadcom sees very little competition between Wi-Fi and 5G. A lot of this becomes extreme hyperbole. If you are out away from everything, on the road, in a forest, I don't care if I could have gotten that data for 1/20th the cost of a Wi-Fi access point because there's no Wi-Fi access point, right? The value of spectrum, mobility spectrum, especially high mobility spectrum, is incredible. So not necessarily saying bit for bit, it's the same value proposition. But it's the story of 2 petrol stations. I've got a petrol station across the street. Potentially I'm paying €3 for a liter or €4 for a liter. And then the other one is inside the super fortified whatever, and I'm paying €57 for a liter. Well, I'm an idiot if I'm paying 57, if I don't have to pay €57 for a liter. This is what we're talking about here. It's all about economics. And so at the end of the day, and you're eating something at an airport, you're captive. You got to pay whatever you got to pay inside that airport because if you want a sandwich, you want a burger, it's €20, whatever, right? Outside on the street, you have more options, right? In this room, it is just far more economical. I just would like a show of hands right now. How many of you in the auditorium right now have cellular connected laptops? Can you please raise your hand? How many? One.
Why would you?
No, I just want to know.
You teetering with your phone,
2,
no?
3, 4. So we're looking at an attach rate of somewhere around 7%, 8%. How many of you are using your cellular right now for connectivity versus Microsoft's provisioned Wi-Fi? 1, 2. So we're now talking about 8% attach rate and then about 50% of that 8% attach rate using this. I'm not demeaning this. I'm just saying, okay, how many of you all have smartwatches on right now? How many of them are cellular enabled versus Wi-Fi enabled? How many of you have cellular enabled smartwatches? 1. Okay. So once again, I'm not demeaning this technology. It's fantastic technology. But the fact of the matter is, we talk about Wi-Fi offload, and I hate that term. Cellular phones have multiple radios. Consumers are going to use the best experience. I don't care. If my user experience sucks on Wi-Fi, I'm Mr. Wi-Fi. I turn off that Wi-Fi radio and I use 5G. I'm looking for the absolute best user experience, and I assume that most other people are. The difference here is the vast majority of IoT-connected devices are only Wi-Fi enabled. They don't even have a cellular connection. And you know, when we start talking about cellular connections, you start thinking about the limits of the value proposition. So let me ask you a question. When's the last time you opened up your screen and all of a sudden everything downloaded 5 microseconds faster and your hair stood up and you thought, man, this is going to cure cancer, right? How do you get excited about this tiny screen and 100 megabits per second or 200 megabits per second? If you can't do anything with this data, it is meaningless. The marginal value of that data is meaningless. We're trying to bring short-range connectivity with VLP. So just like the computer became the neuro center, and I'm connecting all of these other devices from my computer, my cell phone is the neuro center. This is an on-body network. I want to connect it to my glasses. I want to sling it on this screen here. I want to be able to share photos with everybody else. So what I'm trying to do is help the operators monetize their 5G. How are you going to get me to squeeze another 10 euros or 15 euros a month for my cellular subscription to open up something on my phone 1 millisecond faster? What I'm going to tell you is, who cares? But the moment I can do something, I can project this to my car with Apple CarPlay or Google Play. The moment I can project it on the screen, I can create an on-body network. Now we're talking about whole new macroeconomic business opportunities. So for me, it completely defies logic that we'd want to have a better connection at the cell phone and then this be the dead end. If I can't do anything with it, it's completely and utterly worthless. There is no 5G peer-to-peer connectivity standard right now that is prevailing. If you're going to do this, you're going to be sharing and connecting over a license-exempt network, because who owns the spectrum inside Microsoft or inside the airport? Or inside, you got these DAS networks, but if we want to share and do peer-to-peer, you're going to have to do this over license-exempt spectrum. So these ideas of, oh, it's Wi-Fi versus 5G versus cellular, it's really an entire ecosystem. And the faster we can wrap our brain around this, at certain points, I'm going to need 5G or this technology, the Wi-Fi in this. Who cares if I have no backbone? Completely irrelevant. I need both.
Thank you, Chris. But just trying to, please go ahead, and with some supporters in the room. Yeah. But just helping, you know, and here I'm Saul thought about all that much more than me, but trying to, regulators, and probably that's why you, Martin, invited them, will have to decide next year at the WRC, you know, what to do with the upper 6 gigahertz.
No. Can I stop you? Can I stop you,
Okay,
5G guy?
okay.
So what regulators will decide next year is if the crazy Russian plan to be able to share the upper 6 with satellites is technically feasible, which is very different from what Europe should do.
Okay.
And the two things are being used interchangeably. So.
Okay, well, thank you for putting me right there. But shall I, or shall I put it, at some stage, and I see there are distinguished spectrum regulators in the room, so help me out. So I'm going to try again, okay? At some stage, those regulators that have not yet made up their mind, perhaps outside ITU, Mario, I don't know, will have to decide what to do with the upper 6 gigahertz, whether to assign it to Wi-Fi 6 or keep it for the mobile industry, as the GSMA would like to. And while doing so, I guess they will have to, you know, look at Saul's study, and they will have to think hard about, okay, what is the role that we want to give to 5G in our society? And you can have extreme scenarios. I mean, I heard Chris saying, when I'm in the middle of the forest, I have no Wi-Fi, so I love 5G, and I don't mind paying for it, Yeah, of course, Chris, yes. But then, and of course, perhaps in the middle of factory, perhaps Wi-Fi is an unbeatable. I wouldn't say that in a GSA meeting, but probably I can follow you on that. But in between, for example, let's take your stadium, Chris. You had a slide this morning with a football stadium, Liverpool, I believe. Yes. I remember Vodafone or Ericsson slides with football stadium, Philip. This is for 5G. That's why we need it. And then football players will run around with each with a video camera, and you may be in the stadium and with your tablet, and you can of course watch the game, but you can also from time to time watch the game from the point of view of the striker or the goalkeeper, whichever you want to follow, which is very exciting. But that community saw that very much as a natural business case for 5G. And so, in other words, I just gave that as an example, not to dwell too much on football, but I'm trying to get a feel for where there is a broad sections of applications, such as that one, where the two communities have vastly different views, and the poor regulators have got to scratch their head and say, okay, which one is telling the truth, or whether there is, in fact, a rather narrow, list of markets where the two technologies overlap. Whoever, you all want to jump, so.
Well, I have some real world.
Okay, let's go in that order. Okay. Scott, go ahead.
So I was at the Manchester United game on Thursday, and there was all kinds of advertisements about the fancy 5G network that was in there, and there was a questionable penalty called that nobody in the stands could see, and I had no 5G, no connectivity whatsoever for 7 minutes in a place that's advertising their 5G network. Nobody could see the penalty. Everybody wanted to see online what was happening. Of course, the information probably wasn't even online yet, and it brought the network to its knees. Meanwhile, the network that Cisco built for the Super Bowl, while the Super Bowl was going on within SoFi Stadium, the traffic of continental Africa was passing through just that stadium. I don't remember how many hundreds of terabits.
Africa is big enough.
Yes, and people had Wi-Fi connectivity from the undersea Wi-Fi. And what's interesting is it broke out to be very similar to what we see in the real world. 4 or 5% of the connectivity was over the cellular networks, and the rest of it was over Wi-Fi.
That's a good start. Thank you. Scott.
Again, I mentioned when I was presenting that, our company, Scott and my company, we have specialist teams that just do these stadiums. And Scott was just talking about the experience at SoFi Stadium in LA where the last Super Bowl was played. And our wireless CTO, Chuck Lukaszewski, actually recently wrote a whole report looking at the Super Bowl over a period of, I think, 6 years or so. And it tends to be, Cisco, HPE, and Extreme. We tend to divvy up that market, if you will, so it's not the same company each time. But what is consistent is, prior to a Super Bowl, the company, or excuse me, that is the team and the stadium, and the operators and vendors like us spend a massive amount of money and resources preparing for that event, right? All the DAS systems get upgraded. Small cells get deployed nearby the stadium, and the Wi-Fi systems all get updated. And anyways, I'll try to figure out a way to get you the report. Maybe I'll tweet it later or something. But you should look at it because it really compares like the cost per bit, spectral efficiency, and bottom line is that Wi-Fi ends up carrying the vast majority of the traffic at the Super Bowl, and it does it at a very cost-efficient and spectrally efficient manner. So that's the punchline there. And then to your question, Philippe, about is there something that's sort of a clear delineation between IMT and Wi-Fi in terms of use cases? I mean, there's not a bright line. I mean, there's not a black and white, but I think the best one, the most clear one that I can think of is simply indoors and outdoors, right? And certainly, there's cases where you're going to have cellular connectivity indoors, and there's cases where you're going to use Wi-Fi outdoors. But 95% of the time, indoors you can use Wi-Fi, and especially when you're mobile outdoors you can use cellular.
That's,
And 80% of traffic.
that's an easy one to remember. That's
So I think if we were Venn diagramming,
yeah.
I just wanted to say Venn
Yeah,
diagram,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
If we were Venn diagramming this, I think, talking about the, stadium use case is really one where you have a significant overlap. You really do. Stadiums are investing massive amounts of money for DAS networks. You're seeing a huge uptick in cellular 5G. You're seeing a huge uptick in Wi-Fi. But I actually took the report that Chuck Lukashevsky wrote, and I tweeted a single one-pager, and it's 10x lower cost and about 100x higher capacity. So, at the end of the day, economics will win out. These sports venue owners are incredibly intelligent. The chairman of my board owns the Ducks hockey team. And so he talks about all the time the fan experiences that he can put in with better connectivity. And he wants more. He wants more 5G. He wants more Wi-Fi. But this is an overlap, right? At the end of the day, as a regulator, the question that you have to ask yourself is, if you have a national champion and there's an industrial policy, and I understand that, you think there's sort of a minimum sufficient scale for that champion to stay in business, totally get it. But at the end of the day, if you're looking at the overall economy and you're looking at the cost per user, I think in those areas where the technologies are competing, when I worked in the government, I wanted those suckers competing, and I wanted to see the costs per bit drive down. Instead of paying 100 euros for a gigabit connectivity, I'd like to see 70 euros for gigabit connectivity, 50, 40. The competition is good, the competition is healthy, right? So in those areas, I think that we'd want to have plenty of spectrum to meet the use cases and meet the demand. And as we've said before, it's about 10 to 1 right now in terms of broadband demand provisioned over Wi-Fi versus cellular.
And again, I'm sitting on the fence here. I'm not the GSMA guy, but somebody has to. I guess one thought that crosses before letting you continue, Guillaume, just to a few years ago when we first heard about 5G, you had these amazing videos from the likes of Ericsson, Huawei, Nokia, predicting a bright future, which got regulators, government excited, and and it's very much an environment, a future where telcos are expected to invest much more than for a fast 4G. 5G today, frankly, is nothing more than a fast 4G, and they didn't spend much on it. But the hope, I think, in government circles, I understand, I know, not just in China, also in Europe, for example, is that they will eventually, finally build the real thing, the real 5G with the microcells and the low latency and this and that. I see you all smiling, we haven't seen it yet, but now this ain't gonna happen, if there are no applications, that justifies it. And using your distinction, David, outdoor, indoor. So outdoor, I see agriculture. Yeah. I don't know. That obviously, that's a lot of things to be done there. Self-driving cars. Also, I've never understood whether 5G would play a role in actually autonomous driving. I don't know, to be honest. But so what I'm my feeling is, well, my colleague would say, how was it in Paris? I don't know. I don't think there is a business case for building 5G at all. It's probably what I would. Sorry, I'm being a bit provocative. Guillaume,
but
enough rambling.
There's something in what you say which is my struggle with the discussion. It is, are we just caring about? Do we think that innovation is tied to connectivity? Or is innovation something else? And I mean, okay, with my company it's easy to say that, but I believe the value is in the application. You were talking about watching the game from the sideline. You can do that today. So we have NBA games where you can sit courtside and you see the game through your eyes in VR. It's still just a test, a small thing, but you can see that in the future you will be on the pitch and you will see the soccer player playing around you. That's happening today. Why is that happening? It's not because of the quality of the connectivity. It's because of the number of people that can innovate. So there was this tale that Silicon Valley started because the US was the first one to have the internet. I don't think it's true. It's because it enabled some kids in dorms to have access to cutting-edge technology. And so, your vision of the future, you got two choices. Either it's 4 companies in your countries called network operator that are going to be responsible of 100% of the innovation, or it's just making sure that everybody's got the tool to innovate. I'm always coming back to AR/VR, but the barrier to create an AR/VR application is just mastering a 3D game, how do you call them? The engine, the game engine. So Unreal and this kind of game engine. Lots of people can do that. Beat Saber, most popular AR/VR game ever, comes from Czech Republic. You've got AR/VR developer all across Africa. The only thing you need for people to be able to innovate is give them access to cutting-edge technology at an individual level. If they need to have a lawyer to go and speak to Orange and Vodafone to have non-disclosable agreement, innovation is dead. So that's my thing. We should think about what is going to enable people to come up with new ways of working, new ways of learning. And to me, it's putting technology in the hands of people, not of big corporation. Although if you give everything to Meta, I'm very happy with it.
So I have a quick one just to follow on.
Please, Scott.
I sat through the GSA's presentation on why they needed to study 7 to 24 gigahertz in the next ITU study cycle. And one of the applications that they showed was AR/VR, because how are they going to compete with what's going on indoors? And the thing that was shocking to me is that they presented AR/VR in 2013. And it is the same thing with the self-driving cars. We had a leap of machine vision that changed the industry. We went from needing to stream the video from one place to another so that something central could make a decision, to having a whole bunch of videos sent to the cloud, a number of AI models being made, and then clients on the edge that say, oh, this event is happening, and here's the code associated with that event. What should I do next? And so we went from having to stream gigabits of information to, in the moment something happens with the lowest latency possible, sending a code that is never more than about the information that's in a book. And so with a 320 channel in Wi-Fi, you can send that information in a millisecond. There's a couple of milliseconds of processing, and the response comes back to your headset or your robot or your car, pretty much instantaneously. The GSA members have missed that technology advancement and are still asking for spectrum for how we thought AR/VR was going to work 10 years ago. And so that shows when you're network-centric, you miss the technology innovation. And Elon Musk has said, I don't need more than 4G for self-driving cars. And he keeps saying it over and over again. And yet we still have people that want to build this network for 5G roadside applications.
It's not just him. I mean, the federation, the Automotive Federation, European Automotive Federation, when I speak to them about that, a simple question: do we need it? Yes, no. Ooh, Philippe, and it's not at all clear. It's
I just want to tag on to what both Guillaume and Scott said, because one of our mobile industry associations in the U.S. likes to make a statement, or they used to like to make a statement. I'm not sure if many of you have heard this, but that LTE gave rise to the app ecosystem, right? So that because LTE was developed and deployed.
That's true, no?
No, it's not. I think a couple of small
companies. Is it the iPhone?
Yeah, I would maybe give the credit to a couple of small companies by the name of Apple and Google that created smartphones and a platform.
The truth is that the mobile industry wasted billions on 3G and waited for things to happen. For 7 years, nothing happened. And then, yes, you're right. The smartphone appeared because there was a network.
Yeah. Well, it's exactly. It's about having a smartphone with ubiquitous connectivity. I mean, I called the Uber from my hotel room, and I was on a Wi-Fi connection, right? So how much of your app traffic goes over Wi-Fi versus cellular as well? So anyhow, I think Guillaume made the point, right? The value is in the innovation and the services. It's not in the connectivity. You need both.
So I'll be a little bit contrarian here and just say the value is always on. So when I talk to people, once again, they don't care if it's Wi-Fi, they don't care if it's 5G, 4G, they don't care if it's Bluetooth, they just want it to work. Have you tried to do troubleshooting on an iPhone for, you know, your 70 or 80-year-old parent? What's an icon? How do you turn this on? And it can, you know, I'm just saying at the end of the day, it needs to be intuitive. It needs to work seamlessly. The Wi-Fi industry has been working on better roaming. A couple of industry leaders here that make it a lot easier to roam between 5G and Wi-Fi. Absolutely necessary. Who wants to deal with a captive portal and you get caught, you know, lost in space trying to get on board? So it's great that Cisco and HPE are working on this, right? On the flip side, we need to do a better job ensuring that devices, you know, are choosing the best network. You don't roam to an access point that has no throughput. So look, at the end of the day, there's higher value. People develop applications when it works. Okay? If it works in my garage, if it works in my living room, but not in my kitchen, I'm probably going to give somebody a bad review, right? At the end of the day. And so I don't think people care outside of this room. I honestly think people do not care what the technology is. They just want it to work and they want it to be cheap.
Thank you. No, absolutely. Chris, I've got a couple of other but more down-to-earth questions, but I would like to give the floor to the audience. Oh, you've got...
We know we have 1 minute.
Anyway, so who wants to... Please, lady. Can we have a mic here? Oh, yeah, it's coming.
Hi, it's Eleanor from the Alliance for Affordable Internet. So, you know, the University of Michigan, I wanted to understand the funding, how the infrastructure was funded. Was it did you get some funding from the federal states? Because I just want to know, is it purely private?
The funding of the University of Michigan project, whether the connectivity was funded by the university itself, by federal budget, by AT&T, through the university. No, joking.
It's a good question, and it's one that I honestly don't have full information on, but you know, to the best of my knowledge, it was funded by the university. It was seen as a strategic initiative for them to position the university for the future, to enable the research projects that they have going, to provide the connectivity for the students. You know, and so I believe they paid for it. I don't think there was any, you know, federal grant money that would have been available for that kind of a project.
Thank you, Dave. Another question. Then a final one from me then, which is a bit more down to earth than this 5G debate. The regulatory community when the US started with Wi-Fi 6, there were two things that were of interest to the regulatory community. There was, of course, the assignment of the allocation of 1200 megahertz, but also the this business of standard power through the AFC mechanism. And let's not go into AFC. There is a session on that this afternoon. But for things like the University of Michigan project and this sort of, you know, remarkable Wi-Fi project to emerge, the question is, do we need standard power or can we run that on low power?
The stadium, I mean, perfect example. They cannot deploy 6 gigahertz in that stadium because it's an open-air stadium, and so IRA would be very unhappy with me if I put my access points in there today. Once we have standard power, they can deploy there. They have other areas of the campus where they have outdoor Wi-Fi today in 5 gigahertz, and they want to take that up to 6 gigahertz. So there's absolutely use cases. You know, outside of the U.S., you have a number of countries looking at 6 gigahertz as enabling rural broadband, fixed wireless access, reaching parts of the country, you know, very economically. To Chris's point,
Czech Republic is a pioneer in that field.
That would be my answer.
So do we need standard power or?
Yeah, so I would say that absolutely ton of outdoor home premises. You know, I'm in my garden. I have security cameras outdoor. We shouldn't have outdoor client devices, you know, that creates a risk of harmful interference to the incumbents, right? So that's absolutely a use case. There are some countries that have followed the US where there's, it's based on, I'm gonna get really geeky here, lots of power in wider channels, very little power in narrow channels, okay? A Wi-Fi network is defined by its narrow channels. So in Europe, indoor, do I think you absolutely need standard power? No, except in a train station, subway, connectorized antennas. So when you see things, you know, you can't do this with an omnidirectional antenna. You're going to need either a permission to move away from the rules, or you're going to need standard power, right? But in the US, we're limited in our power spectral density. So with my 2.4 and my 5 gigahertz connection, I can connect with her, who's tapping on her watch right now, very, very easily. On my 6 gig connection in the US, I can barely get to IRA. Well, with standard power, I can then have the same coverage area with my 5 gig, my 6 gig, and my 2.4. So indoor, for South Korea, Saudi Arabia, US, Brazil, AFC in Canada, AFC is table stakes. In my mind, all of the residential deployments are going to ultimately be AFC.
Not Saudi. They're the best of all worlds.
Oh,
But anyway.
yeah, Saudi is the best of all worlds.
Martin is indicating that we should break for lunch. So I think you've earned your lunch after that acrimonious debate on Wi-Fi versus 5G. But you know who won. You know, I won't say it, you know who won. Please join me in thanking our great panelists. And